Carmen Lilith, aka the Yoga Witch. Before we get into today's video, I do want to go ahead and let you know I tried really hard for this to be a one-parter, but I did not want this to feel rushed or skip over important parts of history. And also, even with this being a two-parter, we still aren't really getting into everything that I would like to get into today. But we are going to be talking about the witch wound. In this part one, we're going to be talking about the history and kind of like what the witch wound is and where it comes from. And then in part two, which will be coming out next Friday, we will be discussing how and why it still affects women to this day, as well as some ways that we can begin to heal from this wound. So to begin, what is the witch wound? The witch wound is a collective intergenerational trauma that can be passed down ancestrally or through past lives, or even from societal conditioning, whether that be from parents, teachers, media. And it stems from the historic persecution of women, particularly women who do not conform to societal norms or patriarchal control, as well as women such as herbalists, healers, midwives, the unmarried, and the intuitives. It is rooted in patriarchal control and religious extremism. To get a bit into the history of the witch wound, oftentimes people can trace this back to the witch trials, but I believe it starts far before then. So let's go back to Constantine during the Roman Empire. Constantine ruled the Roman Empire from 306 AD to 337 AD. During his rule, he worked to quote-unquote civilize and convert foreigners and those who strayed from Christian church doctrine. He looted pagan temples all across the Eastern Empire, stole their gold, their wealth, their sacred treasures, and used those to fund the expansion of the Christian church, as well as build his city of Constantinople. In 325 AD, Constantine convened the Council of Nicaea. You may be familiar with this if you had a religious upbringing. This council was held to determine what texts would be considered orthodox church doctrine and what beliefs they would keep and hold. Basically, any text that explored themes of feminine power, sex equality, sexuality, sovereign spiritual power, or really just anything outside of patriarchal control standards were deemed to be heretical and illegal, leading authorities and bishops to hunt down, seize, and burn these texts, even though these texts had been a part of the church for centuries. An example of one of these Gnostic texts that was hunted, seized, and burned includes the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, which is the only gospel we know of to this day that was written solely by a female apostle. In this text, Mary discusses how sin does not exist in the way that the church claims that it does. Whereas the church claims that we are inherently evil and sinful and dirty, Mary disagrees. Instead of the 7 deadly sins, she explores what she calls the 7 powers of the ego. And the 7 powers of the ego come up just during the human experience when we forget that we are inherently love, which is her perspective of what God is. It is the power of love that resides in each and every one of us. These powers of the ego come up when we separate ourselves from that love and we forget that we are inherently divine. The Christian church, unfortunately, feared Mary's teachings very heavily because the church wanted to push this idea of you are inherently evil, you are inherently sinful, you are inherently bad, and in order to have any sort of salvation, you must submit to a singular male God, and by submitting to this singular male God, you must submit to these human male leaders. Whereas Mary Magdalene walked alongside Yeshua, which, if you don't know, was Jesus's pre-colonization name, She walked next to him as his equal, as a teacher as well, learning from one another, spreading the gospel together. The church simply could not have her history. Therefore, once Pope Gregory became leader of the Catholic Church, in his Homily 33, he decided to declare Mary Magdalene as the penitent prostitute in order to sully her name and take away her power and disregard her teachings. While there is a lot more that I would love to say about Mary Magdalene, again, this is already a two-parter and we don't have a whole lot of time to get into that, but I will definitely be coming out with an episode on Mary Magdalene as soon as I can. Moral of the story, they destroyed her gospel because it was dangerous to the church's need for patriarchal control and total submission, and also taught that a woman could lead and be in charge. And they just simply could not have that. A few other notable texts that were banned during the Council of Nicaea include the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Acts of Paul and Thecla, the Thunder Perfect Mind, and tens more that we know of to this day, totaling up to over 50 texts. Thanks to a few select monks in Egypt during this time, a few copies of these now found texts were sealed and buried in the Egyptian desert. They were not discovered until approximately 1600 years later, in 1945, within the past century, and they are now known as the Nag Hammadi Library. While Constantine himself did not order for the death of non-Christians, he certainly laid the groundwork for Christian colonialism and eventual witch trials. His son and successor, Constantius II, decreed the death penalty for non-Christians and pagan practitioners in 357 CE, while continuing his father's mission of destroying temples and even reclaiming them, quote-unquote, as Christian. Later, during the Roman Empire, Marcion passed even stricter guidelines and edicts on the persecution of pagans, non-Christian, and cracked down harder on the death penalty. Centuries later, when King James came into power during the 1600s, he held a disturbing paranoid affinity for hunting down women that he believed were witches, as well as some men too, but the majority of the accused were women. These accused witches would be anyone that he deemed to stray from church doctrine and patriarchal church standards. After a near shipwreck with his 14-year-old new bride, Princess Anne of Denmark, James believed that a coven of witches had summoned storms to the sea in an attempt to murder him and his new bride. This became a personal vendetta for him, going as far as obsession, leading to the deaths of tens of thousands and eventually over 100,000 accused and persecuted witches. It is important to note that, as far as we know, none of these women who were murdered were actual witches. A lot of them were simply herbalists, midwives, unmarried widows, spinsters, or women with simple birthmarks that they deemed to be witches' marks. In 1590, James personally supervised the torture and execution of over 70 accused witches during the North Berwick trials. After days, weeks, and even in some cases months of extreme torture, these accused would eventually falsely confess out of desperation to end the torture, often even accusing others in order to protect themselves, which leads into the sister wound, which we will also be talking about in an episode soon. So if you're curious about that, please go ahead and subscribe, turn on notifications so you can be alerted when that episode comes out. With each coerced confession, James became more and more paranoid and saw this as confirmation that witches and Satan were truly after him. It is highly likely that King James was inspired by the 1486 text, the Malleus Maleficarum, which was a guide on how to identify, hunt, torture, and execute witches. And in 1597, he decided to write his own text on a similar subject matter, titled Demonology. This book was written to both document and justify his trials. In 1604, he commissioned a team of 47 Church of England scholars to retranslate the Bible into English from his perspective of what the Bible should be. Mistranslations and verse omissions run rampant in this version of the Bible as a way to proceed in spreading his personal vendetta against witchcraft, as well as women, or truly just anyone who didn't conform to his idea of Christianity and what should be societal norms. A notable example of one of these verses is Exodus 22:18, which is referred to as 22:17 in some versions of the Bible. In the King James Version, it states, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." This has been taken pretty cut and dry as you should murder witches. However, there has been a lot of debate about the original text translating to, "Thou shalt not suffer a poisoner to live." However, this idea comes from the Greek translation of the word pharmakos, which could mean witch, sorceress, healer, poisoner, doctor. So there's a lot of potential translations of this Greek word. However, because this is an Exodus, this is an Old Testament book, which means it was originally written in Hebrew. The Hebrew of Exodus 22:18, which is labeled as 22:17 in this version, says, and please forgive my mispronunciation, Mikashafalo Tekaya. This would more literally translate to, "You should not sustain a witch," or "From sorcery you should not live." In Magic of the Ordinary by Rabbi Gershon Winkler, he describes this verse as advice to not base your entire life off of the powers of sorcery, particularly not sustaining a witch by giving away your fortune and allowing them to fully direct your life through divination or other forms of magic. King James and his writings continue to solidify this groundwork for witch trials to come all across the world even after his death. Now, to get into the alewives and Brewsters. I could get into a very long-winded history of alewives and Brewsters and women making beer and ale, but that would need to be its own episode as well. Which, if you're interested and would like to learn more, please leave a comment, let me know. I'd be happy to cover any topics that you are curious about. So here's a quick 101 over the smear campaign set out against female brewers in order to give context to why we have the vision of witches in media that we see today. I'm talking the brooms, the cauldrons, the cats, the pointy hats. A lot of this iconography can be traced back to alewives and Brewsters. Brewing ale was considered a woman's domestic chores all the way back to 4000 BC in ancient Mesopotamia and Sumeria. Fast forward to the Middle Ages, men often died young due to illness, disease, labor conditions, and war. This left behind many widows who needed to survive on their own. Because these women were skilled brewers, they began to sell their ales at markets and would often wear long, pointed, wide-brimmed black hats in order to stand out in the crowd. They placed broomsticks outside of their homes to signify that ale was made and sold there. Their cauldrons stayed bubbling with brewing ale. And they kept cats to chase and kill the mice that were attracted to the grains they used to brew from. When the Reformation began, this fundamentalist religious movement preached stricter gender norms and continued to condemn witchcraft. Because these Brewsters were typically unmarried and financially independent women who were practically monopolizing the ale industry, men began to accuse them of witchcraft, claiming that they were brewing potions in their cauldrons as opposed to ale. This shut down women's business, forced them into hiding, as well as reduced the men's competition at markets in the ale industry, allowing men to take over the industry. It has been centuries since women were killed on a regular basis for suspected practice of witchcraft. But there are still witch camps to this day in Ghana. While they were originally intended as a place of refuge for women to protect them from violence, they have instead become a place of poverty for marginalized and ostracized outcast women, particularly the elderly, childless, unmarried, widowed. These women are often accused by their own families after a domestic dispute, a failed harvest, an unexpected illness. Accusers utilize the witch stigma to alienate and seclude unwanted female family members, as well as to seize property. Women in these camps sleep on dirt floors and mud huts and rely solely on sparse donations and informal manual labor to survive. Women to this day are still ostracized and outcast and alienated for being different or unique. We still aren't allowed to be religious leaders in many religions, and so many countries have yet to see a female leader. Women still feel forced to shrink themselves, to conform to societal norms, submit to patriarchal standards, and be seen as small, weak, and less than. This witch wound began as a way to protect us from persecution and isolation, but we no longer need to continue living in survival mode. In the Witch Wound Part 2, we will explore how and why this wound still affects us to this day, as well as ways that we see it show up in modern life, its personal and interpersonal effects, and ways that we can begin to heal this wound within ourselves and within the collective. To continue learning about the witch wound and similar topics, please like, subscribe, comment below what else you'd like me to talk about in future episodes. Thank you so much for joining me today. Dreaming out loud, Carmen Lilith, the Yoga Witch.